Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sally Bachman. I'm the Dean of the School of Social Policy and Practice, which some of us call SP2. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this second program in our SP2 speaker series, Confronting Racial Injustice and the Inequities of the Pandemic. Today's program, The Pandemic Economy, Strategies for Economic and Social Mobility, will be hosted by our colleague, Mr. Ben Jealous. Mr. Jealous is a visiting scholar at the Annenberg School for Communication, at the Carey Law School, and at SP2. He serves as the president of People for the American Way. Ben has an unwavering commitment to social change and racial justice, and that's in perfect alignment with SP2's mission. When he was selected to head the NAACP at age 35, he became the organization's youngest ever national leader. His family's strong community activism dates back generation, including his grandmother's connection to SP2. She's a graduate of our school. During these challenging times, conversations like the one we're going to have today play an important role in addressing the complex social problems that SP2 is committed to addressing through education, research, and civic engagement. And now it is my great honor to introduce you to Mr. Ben Jealous. Thank you, Ben. You're on mute.
Yeah, Zoom humbles us all. I'm sorry.
Yes, Zoom humbles us all.
Thank you, Sally. Thank you to the whole team that pulled this together. Thank you to everybody who's joined this important conversation. I'm excited to be hosting this series and today's program, which will directly address the issues of opportunity and equity and social mobility in the context of COVID and this crisis that we're all going through as a nation. I see that we've been joined by Mayor Nutter. Welcome, Mayor. I'd like to point out he's a nutter and I'm jealous. It's good to have you here, old friend. As I was thinking about this conversation we're going to have today, one of the things that just reminded me was last summer, as we had the uprisings, the Black Lives Matter movement kind of fully at the fore, tragic murder of George Floyd. And there's a certain intensity to the uprisings that I couldn't help but feel was related to the moment that we were in. Typically when we're dealing with uprisings in our society, the spark is always police brutality, but the kindling, the logs, what determines how big the blaze is, because police brutality in America is like a lighter that's always flicking, or a cigarette being thrown out the window, hot. What determines whether it becomes a blaze is typically housing conditions, the job situation, matters of discrimination. In the context of the summer, it was also disparities related to healthcare and fears about what this all meant and the underlying vulnerabilities. And here we are now, almost a year in, and it's just clear that all of the issues that have been affecting our society, some of the big ones are just being exacerbated by this moment. And that's the conversation that we want to get into today. Specifically today, we'll focus on the situation today. What tools and resources are the people of this country relying on? Poverty reduction, the actionable research and evidence-based solutions, long-term benefits and impact. If you have questions during the event, please use the Q&A tab to submit them. We'll get to as many as we can later in the program. And now it's my distinct honor to introduce today's speakers. Michael A. Nutter is former mayor of Philadelphia. He is also the David N. Dinkins Professor of Professional Practice in Urban and Public Affairs at Columbia University's SIPA, School of International and Public Affairs. And Ioana Marinescu is an economist and assistant professor at Penn School of Social Policy and Practice, SP2, as well as a faculty research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Michael, Mayor, can you start us off? Please introduce us to your project and share your insights on social mobility in today's society.
Sure. And Ben, thank you for the introduction. I would say, though, that I'm also a executive fellow at the School of Social Policy and Practice, and I want to thank our Dean, Dean Bachman, for her tremendous leadership at our school, and certainly thank you for moderating, and hello to my fellow panelists. This work for me is the one, I guess, kind of continuation from my public service. I was a member of City Council for 14 and a half years, served 2 consecutive terms as mayor. We have a two consecutive term limit, at least here in our city. And since that time, have maintained my focus on the issues of civil rights, human injustice, and economic and social issues that affect our city. And in my view, at least, the most important one, the most impactful one, the one that touches all of our lives, and it's either going to help Philadelphia move forward or potentially hold it back, is the issue of poverty. Philadelphia, unfortunately, has the highest poverty rate of the 10 largest cities in the United States of America. It's been more than 20% for now 40 years. It is ingrained, it is intergenerational, and we have also very high levels of deep poverty, and many, many, many of our children are living in poverty. And so we certainly tried to work on these issues when I was in office. I had the Great Recession right after I came in, but later in my tenure, during my second term, we developed a plan to try to fight poverty and bring it down, Shared Prosperity Philadelphia. This work at SP2 is a continuation to some extent of that work, but we've also now tried to make it larger. And so for so many years, as I mentioned, including my time as mayor, but mayors all across the country and civic and political and social leaders have really been focused in many instances on poverty reduction. Although it has certainly been limited at times to a patchwork of economic development policies and programs, hit or miss, fits and starts, and just trying to move things forward. What's been missing, though, in my view, and my main partner in this work directly is my wife, Lisa, what we've been focused on is actionable, real-time research that identifies solutions that work and can be scaled. Everything must be taken to scale. And we also need access to flexible long-term capital, again, an area in which you are certainly expert in, that supports innovation, as well as helping to promote and put forward solutions to successfully scale these best practices in communities all across the United States of America. As you just touched on, of course, COVID-19 has revealed every inadequacy, every inefficiency, every deficiency in all of our systems across the United States of America. When we look at the issues of poverty, again, between June and November of 2020, 8 million more people fell into poverty, increasing the national rate from 9% to nearly 12%. And that's the largest one-year increase that we've seen in more than 60 years. There's certainly an urgency, but also an opportunity to tackle and take on poverty right now and get people back on a road, some road to prosperity. Prior to COVID-19, this work started, and my wife Lisa is a social entrepreneur. She and I and a ton of other experts and leaders, many of whom at SP2, faculty and researchers, and now this partnership for social and economic mobility represents the great work of 3 universities: University of Pennsylvania, Columbia University, and Johnson C. Smith University, of course, HBCU in Charlotte. This partnership, which will hopefully at a future point in time become part of a center for social mobility and prosperity, is focused on how do we bring the best researchers, how do we bring the best practices, how do we then scale this work to a level with funding. Again, many of our panelists, and certainly you, again, Ben, know that even when we're trying to do the right thing, much of the funding that is devoted to fighting poverty is either not the right kind of funding, not enough funding, or is in conflict with a variety of types of funding that don't prevent the more efficient use of these dollars. And so the Partnership for Social and Economic Mobility is connected to this social mobility impact fund, which is first and foremost an impact first fund that we will use to help scale and bring forward to greater capacity much of the work of the partnership. The partnership will not own the fund, but is certainly directly connected to it, and our various partners will have a seat at the table. We want to again, find these great ideas, and we already have a number of them that have been put forward. Utilize the best in research and practices at these three great universities in Philadelphia, in New York, in Charlotte. We've partnered with a number of thought leaders like Robin Hood, and Columbia University actually has their partnership already in place to use Robin Hood's support and the Columbia University work on the poverty tracker. We seek to bring that to both Philadelphia and Charlotte, and then use all of this data and information and administrative data on the ground to attack what I think is one of the greatest challenges in the United States of America, which is not only the level of poverty, but the depth, the crushing level of poverty that so many people, not only in Philadelphia, but across the country, find themselves faced with. So we've been working on this for a little while, much more work to do, but we've made some pretty significant progress, notwithstanding COVID-19 and almost now the past year being pretty much stuck with Zoom interaction. But the work continues, and we have great partnership, and I am tremendously positive and bullish on the future. So I'll stop there. We have a number of panelists that need to speak, and but that's the basic idea.
Well, Mayor, thank you. And, thank you for the mission that you and your wife have taken on. I'm glad to see you guys pulling it in HBCU and a great Southern city. And it's just, I know for you, you're deeply aware that as genius is constant in every zip code in our country, that when poverty increases, it really doesn't just crush individual lives and leave people deeply troubled and unfulfilled in many ways, but it also holds our society back. It holds our city back. It holds our states back. Yeah.
There is a cost to poverty.
Yeah, there really
significant human costs in addition
and
to
it impacts all of us, as Dr. King reminded us. We are all connected in one garment of destiny. I want to bring into this conversation somebody who's figuring out how the rest of us can rise while the billionaires keep doing better, but most of society is not. Dr. Marinescu, talk to us, please, about what can be done to increase social mobility in these times, to close the gaps, to unleash that human capital.
So, first, let me give you some context here. One thing to note is that, for example, the incomes of Americans who are in the bottom 50%, so the half of the people who are relatively low income, have barely increased at all since 1980. And so economic growth has not been lifting all boats, but instead it's mostly gone towards the top. And in part that's due to wage stagnation. So even when people are working, they are just not making more than they used to once we adjust for the cost of living in the early 80s. And so one remedy to this is to think about ways to increase wages for workers. So for example, the minimum wage. And that's especially important because my work has shown that in many cases, workers lack relevant opportunities so that employers are able to underpay them because they're not able to say, look, if you treat me badly, I'm just gonna go to someone else who will treat me better. For most workers, those opportunities don't exist. So there's not real competition for workers in many cases, and therefore employers can afford to oftentimes underpay them. And so a moderate increase in the minimum wage can help us combat that. So that's one trend that affects many Americans, and it's really important to realize that most of the benefits of growth in this country have gone to the top. And then there's another thing about social mobility, right? Michael Nara just mentioned social mobility. So that's another sort of dark point in our history, in that in recent generations, the work of Rash Chetty has shown that a child has a 50-50 chance of, making it better than their parents. And therefore, they have a 50% chance to be worse off than their parents used to be. So that's a huge change from what we used to have, where 90% of kids would be, having a better lives than their parents. And of course, this has a racial dimension, and that Rash Chetty's work has also been looking at. And I'm putting in the chat here one fascinating graph looking at the evolution over the life course of children, even those who are born privileged. If they are African Americans, they are much more likely to go down the ladder, including to the lowest, poorest part of the population. So, generally speaking, there is an issue here in the fact that the economic opportunities haven't been there for people who are lower income, and that economic mobility is low. So, you're stuck there. And on top of that, there's a racial dimension where that amplifies those trends. And so that's before COVID. And then, unfortunately, we have COVID. And the big thing that has happened with COVID is that it's been a very unequal recession, that the job losses have been disproportionately concentrated among lower income, lower earning people already. And by now, the wages and the jobs of the better off have completely recovered. COVID? What COVID? Times are great, right? But for the bottom of the population, it's definitely not the case. So that this has exacerbated the existing inequalities in the labor market. And so one of the things that needs to be done here is, I mentioned the minimum wage, which is important, but also think about income support policies. And so creating economic security for all is more crucial than ever. And so far, we've been somewhat successful at that with two pillars that I think should be amplified, which is, number one, unemployment insurance generosity has increased to cover a lot more people. First of all, because people who before couldn't qualify for unemployment insurance, for example, because they hadn't worked enough hours or they were in the gig economy, were now able to qualify. And secondly, the amount of the unemployment insurance was made much more generous. And so that has allowed people who lost their jobs to be caught back by this safety net, right, during this pandemic that we normally wouldn't have. So this is the sad part. If you lost your job before, then you wouldn't have had such a generous safety net. Unfortunately, it's temporary. So we have to think about something that would be more permanent, and how do we catch people? And my work has shown that it's important to do that. And certainly during a recession, there are no concerns that this is going to increase unemployment. Mostly it's the insurance role, we're protecting people. And then there's also the cash payments, the stimulus checks, which were universal, quasi-universal, except for the tippy top of the distribution. And those are very important in literally reaching every American. And that's a big issue in the US social safety net, is that it has a lot of holes, lots of holes, a lot of people who are poor and do not qualify for anything to get some modicum of economic security. So we really need to beef up our social safety net with things like universal cash payment or universal basic income. And this is particularly important for families with children, because poverty is the highest for families with children. And so that is one way that we can address social mobility, by making sure that everybody already has enough financial security today. And so, this is important to think about in terms of extending these cash payments and making sure that they continue. So it's a multi-pronged approach, in my view, of both improving labor market circumstances so that people have more opportunities out there, and at the same time making sure that they have the safety net, the financial security to be able to, realize their dreams and take care of their families. So those are the two pillars, and I'm happy to talk more about some of the details about the research on those aspects. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So Mayor, talk to us just about how people in this country are experiencing and surviving hardship in these times? What tools, what networks, what programs are they relying on? And how does your project really seek to help?
Well, a couple things, but first I want to say to my colleague here, Dr. Marinescu, I literally just left I literally just left a meeting. I won't mention the group, but a significant number of economists and former secretary of this and robust discussion about much of what we've just talked about, with virtually no discussion of what you just talked about. And I raised the issue of, there are real people behind the numbers and the graphs and the charts and the quantitative and qualitative analysis and concerns about inflation. And I mean, I'm certainly concerned about that, and monetary policy and what we did in the 60s and what we did in the 70s and what happened in 2008. And I just had to remind them, from my own perspective, because local government is really about people, that there are real people behind these numbers. They're not just numbers and graphs and charts on a sheet of paper. There are real lives that have been damaged. And the big difference here, even compared to 2008, which at the time we thought was the worst possible thing that could happen since the Great Depression, is that the government, city and state and county governments put people out of work, made businesses close. That did not happen in 2008. If you closed or went out of business back at that time, that was an economic crisis. This is now a health crisis. We didn't have hundreds of thousands of people dying. And so it really does require a different approach. And what part of what we're trying to do, and again, this effort, the Partnership for Social and Economic Mobility, started before the pandemic, but the pandemic has certainly highlighted the need for moving people up out of these challenges. And so the work that we're trying to do is really focused on what my wife has kind of coined. This is a think and do tank. This is not just great documents and papers for other people to read, but it really is about utilizing the power of university. I have a theory that one of the most underutilized partnerships anywhere in the United States of America is the partnerships between and among cities and local governments and certainly states, but also the power of academia, the research that comes out, and combining those two powerful forces could lead us to helping people move out of poverty. And so this is really about not just the research, but also scaling up, figuring out what really works, and then how do you do it not for just 100 people or 1,000 people, but tens of thousands of people. And so issues like raising the minimum wage and improving training programs. Stop doing what doesn't work just because we've been doing it for a long period of time, and really let the research and the data affect and change public policy. We know what we know at the time. We make decisions based on sometimes not the best of information. But I think through the course of this pandemic, we hopefully all have learned that we really do need to be bold, willing to take some risk and make the change that will really significantly, long-term, positively affect the lives of real people who are hurting pre-pandemic, during the pandemic, and post-pandemic. Because even when someone says, it's safe to go outside, or vast majority of Americans have gotten a vaccine and it's okay to be out with people, the loss in wages, the closed businesses will have a long-term impact way beyond the time frame of the pandemic. And so what we're trying to do with not only the partnership, but also the fund, is to then pay for and scale up things that actually work, and get the private sector much more actively engaged and involved, because they like making investments and they like making money.
Mayor, I'm going to ask Dr. Mayer, Marinescu a question, but I'm going to come back to the same question, which is, what should the Biden administration be advocating right now to make sure that the situation gets better, the country gets smaller, the gaps narrow?
Right. So first, let me jump on Mayor Nuttall's comment about the importance of experimentation. Obviously, that's very important, and we can learn a lot through state and local experimentation. This is the laboratory of democracy, and hopefully we can scale up. So I think that's very important. And of course, there are, what we wish to do, and I think what we need to do is to, again, really beef up the cash incomes of people to make sure that they have economic security. And I think what Mayor Nutter alluded to is that I wanted to speak to an important debate that's happening right now about the Biden stimulus plan. Some economists say that it's too, quote unquote, too big, and that it's going to lead to inflation. So I really want to say that it's important to push back on that. And first of all, we don't know. Let's admit, we don't know for sure what's going to happen. The future is the future, so we don't know. So, but still, there are things that we can say, and it's important to take that into account. And so, first off, you have to know that monetary policy, the rule has changed, and now they're supposed to aim for 2% inflation on average. But it's been years that we are below that target, which means that if we have to be on average at 2% and we are consistently below that, then in the longer, that means that sometimes we have to be above 2%. So even if this would lead to inflation, it would still be a good thing and consistent with our monetary policy objectives of actually getting more inflation, for one thing. And then the second, so first of all, again, even if it did lead to inflation, I think that's not a danger right now. In fact, we want more inflation. So, that's something that's very important to consider. And, Janet Yellen knows that very well. And second, is this too big, this whole business about the output gap? So basically, like, how much is GDP underperforming compared to what it could be because of this crisis? And people have pointed out that, it seems like the Biden plan is plugging a hole that's bigger than the one that's already there. So that's why they're worried about inflation. But I think, again, the concern, I think, is not valid in the short run, given that we are performing in an underinflation economy. And second, there is the issue of, who's getting all these goodies? And as I just explained, for the longest time, it's the top incomes that have been getting the goodies. And so we have to rebalance the economy so that the prosperity can be much more widely shared. And my view is the following, and it's very easy. If it turns out that we gave out too much cash to everybody, we can fix that. How? By increasing taxes. On who? On the people who have done really well. And one of the easiest ways of doing that is simply by repealing what Trump has done. So we don't need to come up with like your newest thing. It's enough to roll back some of the things that the prior administration has done to already beef up the revenues for the administration and be able to rein in some of that potential inflation should it come about by increasing taxation. So really, I don't think it's a major issue right now. And I think we have to prioritize people's well-being, and especially the well-being of those who are already worse off. And making sure that everybody has financial security. And I think that this is a crisis that shouldn't go to waste in terms of changing the direction that this ship is taking. So, I'm happy to talk more about some of the technical details here.
Gotcha. Mayor, what do you think that we should be doing in the mid to long term? We've got the question of the stimulus and and taxes. I think that she's right on. But what else should we be doing? Because you and I are both aware, just because it's our communities. I mean, like intimately aware that we got long term structural unemployment amongst the Black folks and the white folks who used to work in factories. So what else should we be talking about? You're on mute.
The wonders of Zoom. I very quickly, I do want to comment that again, Dr. Marinescu, the conversation you just had and what you just laid out is literally the exact conversation I was just in a half hour ago. I mean, it is amazing. And I don't think you were on that call, but this fear that, too much money is going to go out, or are people going to actually spend it, or are they going to save it? Or like, how is that a problem in any way, shape, or form, given what has happened? But I don't want to go back down that path. You have covered all of that territory. I think going forward, Ben, as you pointed out, there were already structural issues in the economy, and especially affecting Black and brown people, people of color, and those of lower incomes across every sector. And, the last federal administration talked about a number of sectors, that were coming back, and hung their hat on, coal's coming back and steel's coming back and this is coming back, none of which, of course, were ever true. And people still refuse to recognize that that was one of the big lies that were being told. And so, how are we will we make even greater investments in areas of education? There's already discussion about an infrastructure package, which again, the last administration was going to do it and put something forward for 4 years, never happened. I think we know that is one of the areas that actually puts people back to work. It used to not be so partisan of an issue. And so I think investments in education, clearly investments in healthcare, the disparities still with broadband in cities and rural areas. Suddenly we've come to realize that, all children don't have access to the internet, or they don't have a computer. We didn't need the pandemic to tell us that. We've known that for a long period of time. And then I think lastly, although it is not the last of a very long list, it is significant reconnection and investment between and among the federal government and state and local governments and counties that have been left at the curb, certainly during the reign of the last administration. And we need to reconnect that partnership, somewhat similar certainly to what we had during the Obama-Biden administration. Jobs, what kind of jobs, what kind of training do you, I love Penn and I love Columbia and I love Johnson C. Smith University, but all of the jobs and some of the new jobs do not necessarily require a 4-year bachelor's degree. I encourage everyone to go to college, try college, but certainly lifelong learning and some amount of post-secondary education is critically important in the 21st century. And there are some really good jobs that you can get with certificates from some of the other community colleges and others. And so again, the Biden administration has talked about significant investment in community colleges. I think the thing is, at least with this administration, what day are we on? Have they been in, a month yet? Is off to certainly a great start. And we've gotten, some other business taken care of. We had the insurrection, we had the inauguration, we had the impeachment. Can we get back to governing and start really focusing on the true issues that everyday Americans are really worried about? I mean, those things are interesting, but if you don't have a job, you're probably not talking about some of these other issues.
So let's, look, Dr. Marinescu, you've done a lot of work on universal basic income, and it's obviously, there's a lot of fans of it. I gotta say, what I keep going back to is when I was in policy school in the last century, it was Charles Murray who was pushing this idea, the author of the bell curve. And what he was saying was that if essentially we create what we now call universal basic income, we can gut the social safety net. And he had all these arguments for how that was going to work. What makes us confident, people who believe in a social safety net, that we can have both, one. And secondly, would we be better off with having a individual development account or some sort of, if you will, like universal basic investment fund that allows people to buy a home, invest in an education, start a business, as opposed to just giving everybody, $1,000 a month?
Right. So these are some very important questions. So first of all, there's a lot of different people who see advantages in basic income, and therefore there's different versions. And so a key dividing line is to what extent it replaces some of the existing social safety net, and more progressive supporters of UBI tend to see it as mostly not replacing at least most things, whereas more libertarian leaning, pro-market people want to potentially shrink the social safety net in general. I mean, people would still have this small basic income. So that's really the some of the dividing line. But the key thing to realize is the research has shown that these universal cash transfers that are without conditions actually have the largest beneficial effects on lower income children. They increase the educational attainment of these children spectacularly. They decrease mental health issues and drug addiction. So it has really positive effects, especially for children who are worse off. So then you might ask, well, why don't we just give it to those people? And that gets us into the debate about targeting. And by the way, this buzzword has been around also here in this discussion about the package, because the question is, should everybody or most people get something, or should we try to narrowly give it to some particular people? And of course, there's pros and cons to both. But since we are on UBI, I'm going to try to make the argument for why narrow targeting may not be the greatest idea. And that's for a number of reasons. But one of them is that if you target really narrowly, that puts people potentially in a position that if they better themselves, they're going to lose out. So we get into what we call benefits cliffs, right? That by earning more, you no longer qualify for those benefits. So you might end up worse off than before, which is really, very undesirable. So that's one thing. And the other thing, in a way, almost most importantly to me, is, again, I mentioned earlier the holes in the US social safety net, meaning that a lot of people who are poor do not qualify for enough cash to support themselves. And that's especially true for people without children, because a lot of our programs are targeted at children, but there are a lot of poor people at them who don't have or no longer have children who don't receive those benefits. And even for children, there's a lot of holes in the social safety net. So having something universal is very helpful in making sure that it reaches everybody. It's not necessarily to substitute with something else, but I'm just telling you what is the advantage of something that's universal. And then, of course, comes the question, it could be very expensive. So how do you pay for it? And I think that that's where we have some interesting and difficult political choices to make. Of course, the more you give and the more it requires something to pay for it. But then the question is how you're going to pay for it. And of course, the most progressive way of going about it is to pay for it through a very progressive tax or something like a wealth tax. So that's a way that you would finance it in a way that would, even though the benefit itself, I want everybody here on the call to realize, a universal basic income is the same for everybody. But you have to think net of taxes. So yes, you get the same check, but different people pay different taxes, so that on balance, once you look at both your benefit and how much tax you pay for it, the Bill Gates of the world, maybe they get $1,000 a month, but they pay immensely more in taxes than they get in benefit. So that's really, to me, the way to think about it, is you have to think of the whole structure. The benefit, which again is highly beneficial, especially to lower income children, and then the tax that comes with it. And so having a nice system that has both a benefit for all and a progressive tax, if you want to make it really progressive, is a very promising way of thinking about it. And there's been, for example, plans like the Romney plan, which is quite interesting, which is kind of like a universal basic income only for children, which is already a progress, because I told you a lot of poverty is for children. And there's some hard political choices, because part of what the Romney plan does is to take money away from some programs for the poor to put it into this program. On net, it really decreases poverty, but there's some rearrangement. He also takes some money from high income folks, but I think there's an important debate about what are the priorities in terms of, if we are going to have a benefit like that, how are we going to pay for it? But if you want to make it highly progressive, you can make it highly progressive through an appropriately progressive tax that supports the benefit in question, even though, again, the benefit goes to everybody or essentially everybody.
I just want to remind folks, if you have a question, you can put it in the Q&A. Would love to hear from the audience. While we're waiting on that, Mayor Nutter, we learned in the last Democratic presidential primary that Bernie Sanders' ideas are more popular than he is. What are some of Senator
you said that. You said that.
So what are some of Senator Sanders' ideas that resonate with you as you look into, and as you work in this kind of think, do, to impact poverty? Like, what are some of the big ideas we should be all talking about?
I mean, it is kind of fascinating that, I think prior to the pandemic, there were some electeds, D's and R's, who couldn't even, I think, utter universal basic income. And when the COVID really hit, and folks could see, the impact of it, wild horses could not stop Congress from sending out those $1,200 checks. I mean, it was like, everybody's like, oh, send a check. Well, that's one of the, I think, first major universal basic income projects. Now, they couldn't call it that because, oh my God, that's like a socialist left, kind of idea. So we're just gonna send people checks and you call it whatever you want to call it. So, much of what Senator Sanders and others, talked about, whether it's UBI, what are we doing with Medicare, minimum wage, there's preemption issues all over the place. We have this problem in Philadelphia. By executive order, I raised the minimum wage for companies that had contracts with the city to, I think, I raised it to at least $12, and then there was a CPI, component to it every year. I don't know where it is, today. But I mean, $7.25. Are you serious? Right? I mean, like for a long time. And again, numerous studies out there. So, what I was going to say earlier, coming off of Dr. Marinescu's excellent last remarks, in addition to other excellent remarks, we make a lot of changes in times of crisis, but increasingly I've come to the thought that times of crisis are about the worst times to try to do significant social policy changes because, it's the politics of it all. So what's the right number? Is it 1,200? Is it 1,400? Is it, the 600 now plus the 1,200, 1,400, and now you're getting, $2,000? Where do you draw the line on the unemployment insurance? You have people making seemingly legitimate sounding arguments that somehow it's a disincentive for people to go back to work. Nobody really wants to sit home. People are home because they're afraid to go outside, not because generally they don't want to go to work, although in many instances they don't have a job to go to in the first place because the place is still closed. I mean, I did go to Penn, and I'd like to think that I remember a few things. If we don't get kids K-12 and college back to school, and teachers and young people and kids safely, then they're not going to go to their office because there's a trust and a gap and a health concern, which is understandable. And governments can't get all their people back to work. I mean, it's a step-by-step kind of thing. What do we ask people to do? Stay in your house or be socially distanced, wear a mask, and wash your hands 95 times a day. I mean, it wasn't really that complicated. And so many of these social issues, if we could ever get ourselves stabilized here, Ben, we could actually take on and have legitimate discussion and debate about many of the issues that, whether it was Senator Sanders or Senator Warren or then Vice President Biden or anybody, when are we going to have a serious non-completely inflamed discussion about the social safety net. I mean, this is the United States of America. I do believe we are still our brothers and sisters keeper. I mean, you even think about President George Bush, the 43, right, who now, of course, based on the last administration, I mean, looks like, an incredible statesman, talked about, what was it? Compassionate conservatism. I mean, we've always tried to look out for people in some way, shape, or form. And we've just increasingly become isolated and, well, if you're not working, you're just not trying hard enough. Really? Right? We need to make continued adjustments to the SNAP program because what? Americans have too much food? Are you serious? Right. So, the political and the philosophical and the economic and all of these discussions come into play, but they're usually in moments of crisis. And then, can you get, what is it, in Congress, 218 in the House and 50 or 51 votes in the Senate, and that's the new policy. I mean, that's not a way to make policy. That's just politics.
I'm going to give the two final questions to Ms. Marinescu. I'm going to be smoother on that name next time, I tell you. I just I have a little bit of stutter and it's catching me up.
Marinescu.
So the one comes from the Q&A, which is, and I'm going to give you both and then answer both, please, which is there are some people who will say that a policy of universal basic income or an increased social safety net will lead to dependence on the government and a lack of, quote, self-sufficiency. How would you respond to someone who proposes this as a problem with an increased social safety net or UBI? That's the first question. The second question is for me to you, which is, whether it was Thomas Paine or whether it was de Tocqueville, people coming from Europe to the US have often given us some of our best ideas for how to move forward. If you were writing the common sense of this moment, what would your prescription for this country be? So those are the two questions.
All right, so let me tackle the first question first, since it's more, technical. With respect, I'm perhaps the best person to answer this because I specialize in labor economics. So, will something like a universal basic income stop people from working? Well, several things on this. First of all, with a universal basic income, you eliminate the benefit cliff, which is something that can, in fact, stop people from working or working more. Remember, like when you go above a certain income, some benefits are completely taken away from you. So that is already a better feature of that. Now, it is true that we predict from economics that the more money people have, just overall, that is not conditional on anything, and the less they work. And that's called the income effect, right? Because if you're richer, you don't need to work as much necessarily to satisfy your needs. However, a lot of research has shown that benefits like this, in fact, do not decrease work or only marginally. And then there is an effect that it's easy to neglect and is so fundamental to get here, which is the stimulus effect. When you put money into people's pockets, this money goes to local businesses. That is very important. And in our work on Alaska, we showed that there was no effect on employment. Alaska has something like a universal basic income since 1982. It has no effect on employment. And we showed that essentially it's because even though some people might want to work a little bit less, at the same time, local businesses having more customers want to hire more people. And so those two effects counteract each other so that there's no effect on employment. And I want to add one more important twist is that if you think about what I told you earlier, which is that a universal basic income on net would benefit the poorest, right? Because the taxes are, such that if you're richer, you're also paying more taxes. So on net, you're not really getting more money. Because the universal basic income benefits the poor, which businesses benefit the more? Those that are in poor neighborhoods. And that's really fundamental because that makes us circle back to we're all in this together, and also to workers' situation that, if in poor neighborhoods, there's not enough businesses that can employ people, that worsens the situation for the residents of these neighborhoods. So there is a sense in which the universal basic income, while on paper, it's universal, and that's actually a positive a trait of it that, makes it, I think, more agreeable. At the same time, it's oftentimes going to especially help for those who are already more disadvantaged. It's also going to help rural communities, because similarly, they don't have as much businesses. And also over there, that income goes a longer way, oftentimes because the cost of living is low. So there's a lot of people right now who are disadvantaged that this would help. So that's just something that we have to keep in mind in terms of the income is not just income in people's pockets, but it's also income for businesses that these people patronize. And that's, the way in which money circulates in the economy. And then, what should you do? Well, I mean, obviously, that's the $1 million questions. My vision is that you have to both improve conditions for workers so that people have good jobs that they can go to in a competitive market where there's enough diverse employers that people can choose whatever they want to go to. And employers similarly can choose who they want to work with. So a competitive labor market where people are paid fair wages. And at the same time, we need to have financial security for all. Because, for many, we've seen with this crisis, people will not always have a wage to depend on. So we want to make sure that no matter what, you'll never fall through the cracks and you'll always have economic security. And in this country where we're at now, something like a universal basic income, cash for all, is a very promising way of achieving that, of really making sure that everybody has enough for the basics, no matter what. And remember, this can still be a very progressive proposal when you pair it with a progressive income tax. So the way I see it, if you put a universal benefit to all, and you pair it with a progressive income tax or a wealth tax, this is a way that the country can move in a positive direction. And also in terms of the wealth tax that Senator Warren has proposed, we also have to remember, because today we're talking about racial justice, the importance of a wealth tax to right the injustice that came from the past, because a lot of the wealth, because of this historic injustice, has accumulated into the hands of white people. And by having a very aggressive wealth tax and then redistributing the proceeds to everybody, we can right some of those wrongs. It's not necessarily enough, and just to be clear, but it's one way that this policy can help us reach greater economic as well as racial equality.
Well, and you may have just come up with the slogan for campaigns in 2022 and 2024, which is cash for all. But the
that's going to be very popular.
You heard it here first.
Thank you, Mayor Nutter. Thank you, Dr. Marinescu. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Bourgeois to close us out.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Ben, Michael, and Ioana for this incredible information in our discussion today. As SP2's Associate Dean for Inclusion, I want to emphasize that conversations like this one are vital to our school's mission and is a prime example of the necessary dialogue we want to continue to engage in our community. SP2 remains steadfast in its commitment to anti-racism, anti-oppression, intersectionality, inclusion, diversity, and social justice in all of our 5-degree programs and throughout our interactions with our colleagues, students, alums, and our external partners. I invite you to learn more about our work by visiting our SP2 inclusion page, and we have that link in our chat. And I thank everyone who joined us today. Details will be coming out very soon about our next speaker series event, and I hope that you'll be able to join us. So stay tuned. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.